This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, 20, Tranquility, we copy.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Kneel before me. I said, is not this simpler? Is this not your natural state? It's the unspoken truth of humanity that you crave subjugation. The bright lure of freedom diminishes your life's joy in a mad scramble for power, for identity. You were made to be ruled. In the end, you will always kneel.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll be discussing the initial steps of how the Nazis transformed Germany's democracy into a dictatorship. The clip you just heard was a well-known scene from the first Avengers film from 2012. If you haven't seen it, it's when the villain Loki comes to Germany and he tells everyone to kneel because he's going to become the dictator of Earth. And of course, everybody does it. And then you have a bunch of brief philosophical one-liners about the nature of humanity and dictatorship. And then Loki throws down with Captain America, who's there to save the day. And of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of being in Germany and Nazism. There's part of the clip I left out where there's like an old man who stands up and is kind of like, we're not going to bow to you. Right? This isn't Nazi Germany 2.0. Now, I played this clip at the start of our episode today about the establishment of Nazi dictatorship because I really like the way that it talks about the subject, the way it articulates our fears about dictatorship. As people who live in a democracy, and my guess is that most of you out there listening to this today live in a democracy or a democratic society, but as people who live in a democracy, isn't one of our fundamental principles the idea that we have these things called natural rights, that no government can legitimately take away those rights from you? In your life, don't you like having the right to free speech? Don't you like being able to go out and say almost whatever you want to say to give your opinion about the things that are affecting your life? Don't you want to live in a society where the press will be able to report on those in power without fear of arrest or reprisal? Don't you treasure the idea that we, the people, get to select and change our leaders, and we do that not through violence, not through whoever has the most connections or some sort of smoke-filled room, the elites, they're making those decisions? No. Don't you like to live in a country where you have regular, honest elections and we get to choose our leaders through our rights to vote? At a sort of basic and fundamental level, if you live in a democratic society, don't you like the idea that you have a large degree of control over your own life? That you get to make the choices. No one's there to do it for you or to tell you what to think or how to act or what to believe. So growing up with such values, whether they were what you experienced because you live in a democracy, or is it something that you aspired to? If you talk to people who lived through communism in Eastern Europe, if you talk to people that have escaped places like China or North Korea or Cuba, doesn't the idea of losing these rights, these basic natural rights that are at the fundamental bedrock of a liberal democratic society, doesn't that terrify you? Can you imagine willingly giving those up? Willingly saying, oh, okay, I don't need the right to free speech anymore. Go ahead, throw me in jail if you don't like what I say. Certainly there's been a lot of films that have been made about this idea of the anxiety of people living in a democracy from losing it. This is something that predates even the formation of the United States, right? It's over 250 years old. This idea that, well, you can have a Roman Republic, but at some point, what happens if it turns into an empire? How many movies are there? How many books like 1984, movies like Star Wars that talk about this transformation of a republic into an empire? How many stories are there where we become ruled rather than having a voice in government, or at least having governments that look out for our behalf? And so the subject of today's podcast is a really important one. It goes beyond just the question of what happened and who did it and when, but it gets into these deeper philosophical questions about government, about society, about the nature of human beings in some ways. What we really want to know when we start talking about the establishment of Nazi dictatorship is, how did the Nazis do it? Why did so few people resist the destruction of their own democracy? And implicit in all that, of course, is, how do we avoid making the same mistakes? We are living in an age, one could argue, where the certainty of democracy, the faith that, well, democracies will just always exist, we are living in an era where, rightly or wrongly, people have anxiety about that. So again, the key question that we want to get to today is, how did the Nazis do this, and why was there such complacency or such acceptance of it? Now, as historians have looked at the question of how democracies have become dictatorships over the years, there are two sort of extremely broadly defined answers that they've come up with. And the classic answer, which is also in many ways the sort of popular perception of it, is, how do you get a dictatorship? Well, dictatorships are imposed. The origin of the power of a dictatorship comes from outside. It is external. Dictators build a government, build a society, and they impose it on us against our will, and they frequently do that through the threat or use of violence. I don't consent to living under a dictator. The dictator forces me to do it because there are some awful consequences for me, often violent. I might end up in a concentration camp or a gulag. And so again, we understand this to be something imposed, something that's external. And if you watch The Avengers, again, The Avengers, it's all about fighting, and some people get annoyed with the dialogue, some people are there for the special effects, which are really cool. But one of the things I love about the Avengers series is that they do work in these kind of philosophical comments every now and then. The visual feel of when Loki shows up, here's violence, I just blew up a police car, everybody kneel before me. Right? This is an expression of this perception of, how do we get dictatorship? It is something that is imposed upon us. Kneel or face violent consequences. As we move through today's episode, we will certainly see that the Nazis use quite a bit of violence. The Nazis, as well as the communists, one of their biggest distinctions from previous movements and previous ideological political groups is that both the Nazis and the communists, they like the idea of using violence. They see it as a tool for creating social harmony. So we're going to see a lot of violence today. But it's also worth noting that between the 1970s and the 1990s, in various formats, various different angles and perspectives, there kind of developed a second way of thinking about the imposition of dictatorship. And it's not really a school of interpretation in the way that we, as historians, as academics, that we usually talk about this kind of thing. But one could argue that it is kind of a philosophical approach, right? How do we get dictatorship? The answer is not that it's imposed upon us, but that we accept it. That it comes less from the idea of, well, there's a gulag out there, they might hurt us, than it does in elements of human psychology. That, as Loki says, isn't there a part of all of us that wants to be ruled? That wants to be subjugated, that wants to have someone tell us, this is what you do, here are the boundaries, don't worry about what's going on outside, just focus on what's immediately in front of you. Don't worry about making choices for yourself. Let someone else do that for you so you don't have to deal with the burden of thinking. In scholarly terms, there's a number of authors and people that have kind of expressed this interpretation, but one of the strongest arguments is made by a guy named Václav Havel. Havel was a playwright. He was a dissident in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. And he wrote this amazing essay called The Power of the Powerless, where he gets into what is the nature of totalitarian society. Where does it really get its strength from? And I'm not going to go into the whole thing right now because we can get into it later. As I said, we're talking a lot about violence today. But it's worth noting that there is this idea that, again, how do we get dictatorship? It's because we accept it. Because we can imagine ourselves having control over our lives at the very moment that we give up that control, that we give up those natural rights, that we kind of retreat inward and we say, I'm going to create my own reality in which I lie to myself and I tell myself that I have power. I tell myself that the party cares about me, that we're living in a worker's paradise, whatever it is. And those lies then enable me to tolerate or even accept my own subjugation. If you want a more visual explanation of this or pop culture explanation, go watch The Matrix. The Matrix essentially makes or presents this same argument. Not to give away too much of it if you haven't seen it, but one of the characters says, I would much rather live in a computer simulation and have my body basically be, a battery for machines, for AI, because it's more comforting to live in the world of lies than it is to live in the reality. So the key point here again is that both groups view the idea that dictatorships draw their power from internal psychological factors, and that living in a dictatorship is in some ways, a choice. That you actually still have a lot of power, even if you're not someone armed with machine guns and tanks and weapons, and you can really fight back violently. So over the course of the next couple episodes, I'm going to give you a little bit of both of these kind of philosophical arguments as we explore the history of Nazi Germany, and especially as we look at this question of how do the Nazis build one of the most effective, most complete totalitarian societies in history. Again, today we're going to be talking more specifically about how the Nazis eliminate their political rivals. And so we'll see that there's a lot more violence involved in this process than there is psychology. That said, we will see some psychology. We will talk about some of the parties that in some ways choose their own destruction. Other episodes might get a little bit more into, again, the psychological aspect of things. By the way, I should note, for those of you that are listening for the first time, this is one of a number of episodes that we've done on the rise of Nazi Germany. We go all the way back to the founding of the Nazi Party. We talk a little bit actually about World War I. You can find a complete list of these episodes on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. You can also see some of our other episodes listed here. We have about 20 hours on the history of Israel-Palestine. I'm recording this at the end of November in 2025. We have Christmas coming up, so if you want to know more about the origins of Christmas and not just the kind of biblical story, but the way that Christmas was celebrated, how it became commercialized, we have 2 episodes on the history of Christmas that have proven to be very popular. We also have some Patreon-only episodes, especially about Nazi Germany. We have a couple on, for example, the making of Hitler, the rise of the SS, and these can be accessed for just $2 a month via the website Patreon. Finally, before we get into the meat of the story today, the blow-by-blow details, I want to make just a couple quick observations that we're going to run into as we move through the history, right? So in trying to understand and in trying to explain that question of why and how do the Nazis pull this off, there are a couple key kind of themes that I just want to highlight at the very beginning before we get into the timeline of events. And the first thing that I want to say is that I don't think we appreciate enough the speed with which the Nazis dismantled German democracy. Now, I don't just mean here the idea of when Hitler kind of took power, when Hitler began using that power and made it very clear that the Nazis were the ones that were in charge, but I mean the erasure of long-held civil liberties that had been the bedrock of German government even back during the Kaiserreich. So forget about Weimar for a second. Think back to the very formation of a German state in the 1870s. As that is being done, yes, you still have a Kaiser. Yes, the Kaiser still has lots of power. But they also put into the Constitution a number of these natural or civic rights. Imagine for a moment that tomorrow in the United States, or that in the course of, let's say, 5 months in the United States, they just got rid of the right to free speech, the right to freedom of religion. That seems to us like it would be fairly controversial, fairly difficult. And yet, the Nazis in just a couple of weeks destroy, not just defeat, destroy, eliminate, break their primary political enemies, at least nominally speaking, in the communists. It just takes a couple of weeks. After just 5 months in power, the Nazis have not just become, the largest party in the Reichstag, or they're putting some pressure, they're using some dirty techniques to make sure that they've gerrymandered themselves into an absolute majority. No. In 5 months, they have banned every single other political party in Germany, including their own coalition partners. Perhaps more amazingly, there is almost no resistance to these efforts. Again, I said, what if tomorrow in the United States they started pulling apart the Bill of Rights? You'd think some people might object to it. You'd think there would be more than just, we voted on it, we just decided to get rid of the Bill of Rights. Oh, well, I guess it's gone. You'd think there would be more outcry, more pushback, general strikes, violence, uprisings, demonstrations. And yet in Germany in the early 1930s, I shouldn't even say the early 1930s, in early 1933, in just a single year or even less than a year, German democracy, the belief in the existence of natural rights, these things are swept away like a sandcastle before the tide. Now, it's important to note that one of the ways that the Nazis accomplished this was through the revolutionary mindset that they brought to governing. And we'll talk about this more later in the episode. There were certainly German politicians like Franz von Papen, like Kurt von Schleicher, like Paul von Hindenburg. You could even say Friedrich Ebert if you want to go back to the early 1920s. But there were certainly German politicians who had either skirted with the idea of law or who had been willing to kind of push past the boundaries of democracy. They said, we're gonna suspend civil rights every now and then. We're going to dissolve the Prussian government because we don't like who's leading it. So there were certainly precedents that the Nazis had used or relied upon in terms of going beyond what was previously acceptable. But the Nazis also use a revolutionary mindset. They don't come to power saying, okay, now that we're here, let's enjoy being in power. Let's try to do some things using the systems, the traditions, following more or less the way that things had been done. let's try to play the game of politics more or less within the boundaries according to the rules of the game that everyone else has been playing. And maybe we'll, break one or two rules here or there. Maybe we'll, sneak something here or there. But the Nazis decide, let's just reinvent the rules from the beginning. We are here to carry out our revolution, and anything that gets in the way of that will be swept up and destroyed. To kind of put this another way, there are many conservatives in Germany in January of 1933 who want to see a dictatorship built, who thought as Hitler embarked on this process that he was doing something good. Just months later, some of them will find themselves in jail. Some of them that were coalition partners will be out of the government. Some of them will start being the victims of Nazi oppression. Their papers will be banned. Their parties will be dissolved. And a big part of this, again, a big reason why the Nazis move so quickly is because they come into it with a revolutionary mindset. We are here to reinvent everything, not to play by the rules of some political game as it has existed. I don't think that many of those conservatives really anticipated how completely the Nazis would erase things like civil rights, how they would destroy the rule of law. They certainly didn't seem to anticipate the idea that once the Nazis got rid of the kind of collective enemy at the time, the communists and to some extent the socialists, that the Nazis were going to come after them. It's one of these kind of episodes in history where you say, well, be careful what you wish for. Lastly, another key part of what made the Nazi assault on civil rights so successful was the way in which they cloak their revolution in the seeming legitimacy of the law. In other words, in contrast to what the Soviets do, the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks, if you haven't listened to our episode on the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks come in and say, we are starting from scratch, we are abolishing everything, we are going to create entirely new institutions that will create entirely new ideas of law because we live in a revolutionary society. The Nazis, on the other hand, will use law to build their dictatorship. They use law to make it legal to ignore the law. As crazy as this sounds, the Nazis never prorogue or abolish or dissolve the Weimar Constitution. Technically speaking, everything they do is legal because the act, as we'll talk about in a little bit, that establishes, that builds from a legal standpoint dictatorship, that act is approved by the Reichstag. It is voted on and approved by parties other than the Nazi Party. And so the consequences of this approach are pretty profound. If you believe in law and order, if you believe in the Constitution, how do you then say, I resist the laws that have been passed legally, I resist the new parts of the Constitution, even though they were passed legally? How do you say, I support the law by fighting the police? How do you say, I am a defender of the state by rebelling against it? As we'll see, these kind of mental contradictions are in some ways as important as the physical ones. In 1920, as we talked about, there is a putsch in Germany. It's called the Kapp Putsch. The kind of conservative nationalists try to take over. The army kind of, sort of says, well, we're not going to get involved in this. We'll see what happens. The conservatives take over Berlin. They have the government. They've won the revolution. But they are met by a general strike that paralyzes Germany. And ultimately, it forces those who had briefly taken power out. Why don't we see a Kapp Putsch in 1920? Why does the establishment not crack down on the revolution against the Nazis in the way that they did in Munich in November 1923? A huge, huge part of that answer, I would argue, is because the Nazis use law and people have a mental problem trying to fight back against the law. Okay, so far I've been going on about these kind of broader interpretive issues. Let me get down into the history itself, and let us start by talking about the situation on January 30th, 1933. And I guess the best place to start is, again, this idea of what does Hitler have when he is named Chancellor? As I'm going to point out, Hitler is certainly endowed with a lot of power. It's certainly a momentous moment in the history of Germany. Many contemporaries are aware of this. As the nation's chief executive officer, Hitler has nominal control over things like the nation's police. He controls the finances. He controls the levers of bureaucracy. Now, we should note that this comes with an asterisk because there isn't really a strong national police force in Germany during the Weimar Republic. There is no kind of equivalent of the FBI at the time. Most of the policing powers are actually carried out at the state level. So in the United States today, we have kind of a mixture. We have national police organizations. We have state-level police organizations. You have local police, obviously, as well. And so in Germany, to be the state interior minister is much more important and influential. Now, at the ministerial level, where considerable power is often exercised sort of on a day-to-day basis, the Nazis also control the Ministry of Interior under Wilhelm Frick. They also have a number of cabinet members that were not technically members of the Nazi Party, but their ideological loyalties were very much with the Nazis. A great example of this would be Hitler's first Minister of Justice, a guy named Franz Gürtner. Franz Gürtner had been a member of the German National People's Party, or the DNVP. He had come to prominence in the early 1920s in Bavaria, where he had been the Minister of Justice. But Gürtner is not really independent. Gürtner was also very sympathetic to the Nazi Party. He was the one that had engineered Hitler getting out of jail early in 1924. He later works to get the party's ban lifted in Bavaria. And so, again, you can kind of have an asterisk on him. He's going to do whatever Hitler wants him to do. Finally, we also have Hermann Göring. Göring at this time was a minister without portfolio. So he's a member of the cabinet. He's involved in the discussions. But he is also the leader of the Reichstag. And as we saw, this gave him some important influence in the run-up to Hitler being appointed Chancellor in January 1933. However, it's really important to note at this point that Germany is not yet a dictatorship on the day that Hitler is appointed Chancellor. Hitler does have a lot of power. We just talked about some of his advantages. But in theory, he is not ruling on his own behalf or even on behalf of the Nazi Party. He is part of a multi-party coalition with a number of prominent conservatives who are nationalists, but they're not Nazis. One of those guys happens to be the Vice Chancellor, Franz von Papen, who had just briefly before been the Chancellor, who has a very cozy relationship with the President, Paul von Hindenburg, who also happens to have a tremendous amount of power. In fact, Hindenburg has the power to dismiss Hitler. Hindenburg, by the way, although he had just appointed Hitler to be Chancellor, had always been pretty highly dismissive of the guy he called the Austrian corporal, right? Kind of dismissively. Hindenburg is an arch-conservative. He's an old-school guy. He's a noble. He's a Junker. He doesn't like the idea that some commoner is going to come up through the ranks. What could that person possibly know? He doesn't particularly like the Nazi Party, these rabble-rousers, these guys on the streets, these guys that they talk about elements of socialism. And so up until his death, Hindenburg again has the legal power at any point to remove Hitler. And more importantly, as the kind of hero that emerges from World War I, Paul von Hindenburg had the social and political gravitas to dismiss Hitler. He had the backing of the army. And so, not to give up too much of the story, but until Hindenburg's death in August of 1934, most historians would argue that Hitler did not have yet a complete dictatorship or a totalitarian dictatorship. It wasn't just Hitler's word at that point. There were still some limited checks in theory on his authority. But we can go deeper in this idea that Hitler's dictatorship was not yet built. It was much limited on January 30th, 1933, when he came to power. The institutions of state at this point are staffed by a host of non-Nazi bureaucrats. Some of them have agendas. Some of them aren't really political players. They think about what they're doing as being a loyalty to the state, a loyalty to the German people. They're not thinking in terms of politics. And in a way, that is a bulwark against the centralization of power. In today's parlance, some people like to call this the sort of deep state phenomenon. But you can also, again, think about it as a check. Think about all those bureaucrats, all those police officers, for example, who are not necessarily political. They are just thinking about, how do I do my job? If you are a police officer, is your job not to police crime? Do most police officers not go around thinking, okay, this guy was speeding, this guy was embezzling, this guy was guilty of arson or assault or whatever. My job as a police officer is to enforce the law, and therefore I will arrest this person, and then they can have a trial, and they'll get, in the United States, a defense attorney, and that defense attorney isn't thinking, well, do I like this client? What is their political background? Do I agree with their ideology? They're thinking, my job as a defense attorney, I will present the best defense I can. My job as a prosecutor is not to favor one side or the other. If you don't want to put this in political terms, I'm a Chicago Bears fan. Do I look at the defendant and go, well, this guy's a Bears fan too. I'm going to, knock down this charge. I'm going to be lenient on them because I like the same football team as them? No, that's ridiculous. So my point is that the government in Weimar Germany is full of people who see their jobs in a sort of professional way, who aren't political. And when the Nazis take over, the question is, are they going to do the things the Nazis want them to do? If you're talking about arresting common criminals, fine, it's very normal, right? Just continue as you were. But as we start to go beyond the definition of what had been normal, do those individuals go along with it? In Soviet Russia, for example, when the Bolsheviks come to power, many of the civil servants go on strike. Many of the civil servants say, no, we're not going to go along with this. And they get basically fired, and many of them get arrested, and it doesn't work out well for them. Now, the most important institution that we could say is part of the quote-unquote deep state, if you want to call it that, in Weimar Germany, is the army. It is the deepest of states in some ways because the army isn't particularly loyal to the Weimar Republic either. The army has its own sort of idea, which is we want to, first of all, be preserved. We don't want to get dissolved or replaced by somebody like the SA or like some kind of people's militia. We want to get rid of these checks on the size of the army, on the weapons we can use. We'd love to rearm. If we have to fight another war, great, let's do it. Let's carry on the great tradition of German conquest and return to national glory. But the army has its own agenda. And so the Nazis, in order to fully establish a complete totalitarian dictatorship, they have to break the power of the army. Of course, the biggest group that the Nazis have to worry about is the people themselves. We've mentioned in several episodes, the Nazis become the largest single party in the Reichstag in the summer of 1932. They lose some seats, but remain the largest party in the November 1932 elections. But they've never won more than about a third of the vote. Their highest total is about 37.3% of the national vote. About another third of the electorate is either diehard communist or diehard social democrat, and those people hate Nazism. Those people don't want to go along with any of these Nazi changes. The communists and the Social Democrats also are not just a bunch of voters. These are sophisticated political operations. They have their own budgets. They have their own newspapers. They have their own sort of press campaigns. And most importantly, they both have armed militias, large paramilitary formations whose sole purpose is to fight it out with the Nazis. So while Hitler had been given tremendous power through his appointment as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, there are a lot of limitations on what he can do. Many of his enemies expect him to fail in short measure. If Franz von Papen and Kurt von Schleicher, if their governments had only lasted for a couple of months, many Germans reason, why would Hitler be any different? Franz von Papen, at least, was a professional politician, seemed to have his stuff together, was a conservative, was an aristocrat, had connections. Kurt von Schleicher came out of the army. If those guys couldn't get it done, how is this guy who lived in a Vienna men's home with all his rabble-rousers from the streets of Munich, how are they going to be able to pull off governing a chaotic and crazy situation like all of Germany? Again, to put the question in a very simple way, how on earth do the Nazis do this? The first answer, as I've said, goes back to this idea that the Nazis approach the idea of governing from a revolutionary rather than a governing perspective. And it is this kind of important theoretical point that really explains a lot of how they get away with it. So let me, again, just say a few more words about it, and then I'll get more into the history. In a normal situation, in any democracy, when a party takes over power from a different party, they understand at a sort of fundamental or a basic level what they are trying to do is to run the country on behalf of all of the people that live in it, not just the ones that voted for them. Now, of course, they have different ideas about how to do this from the previous party. They may favor their voters. They may say, well, we're going to pass legislation that helps the people that supported us. It's fairly basic and obvious and rational. But there is a tendency to respect existing laws and norms, because what happens when the shoe is on the other foot? What happens when your party is now in the minority? You want to make sure that certain basic things are being done so that your voters, the people that you represent, don't get completely screwed. To put this another way, there is a certain broader mentality or ideology of how things are supposed to operate in government. And the parties across the various political spectrums, the parties essentially agree on this way of doing things, right? There are rules to this game. And even if we have subtle, arguments about the specific interpretation, we can agree on the general principles of what we're doing. And again, this goes down to a kind of more fundamental level with bureaucracy. A policeman is there to enforce law and stop crime. They are not concerned about the background of the perpetrator or the background of the victim, or in circumstances where that turns out to be the case, society gets very alarmed and wants to do something about it. A welfare agency should not issue or deny benefits to people based on what political party they belong to. The Nazis, however, come together with a different revolutionary understanding of what they are doing. The purpose of Nazi government, as they understand it, is to improve the overall welfare of the German people. But the path there, they believed, required the destruction of the Weimar state, and not just its kind of like specific constitutional offices, but the very kind of legal foundation, its very ideology. We want to go from having a liberal democratic society with the idea of natural rights to a fascist totalitarian society where we believe in the Volk or the people, and everything goes back to what is good or bad for the people, and the person who decides that is the leader or the Führer. From a mental perspective, what I just talked about means erasing the old rules of the political game. The point of the police or the school system is not to carry out basic functions in Nazi Germany, like how do you learn your 3 R's, arithmetic, reading, and writing. Instead, it is to carry on a political or ideological mission. As Hans Frank put it in 1936, the job of a judge is not to help enforce a law. It's not to impose a system of universal values on the population. It's not about justice in the liberal democratic sense of the word. The job of the judge, in his words, was to, quote, safeguard the concrete order of the racial community, to eliminate dangerous elements, to prosecute all acts harmful to the community, and to arbitrate disagreements between members of the community, end quote. In this sense, there are no boundaries, no limits, no precedents that could limit Nazi behavior or actions. The Nazis essentially shared with the Soviets the belief that the state and its institutions exist to win the political or ideological war. They do not believe in the idea of justice, again, in the liberal democratic sense. They do not believe in, here are basic rules of the game. The rules matter more than who wins the game. And so what this means in a practical sense is that from day one, the Nazis saw any means possible as legitimate to achieve their ends. We can see this already within the first weeks after the Nazis came to power. On February 17th, 1933, for example, Hermann Goering orders the Prussian police to stop surveilling the Nazi Party. Previous to this, during the Weimar Republic, the police in Germany are worried about revolution, and they're worried about it not just from the left, but they're worried about it from the right as well. And so at various levels, they've done a lot of spying. They're trying to, what is the SA up to? What are the communists up to? And so Goering says, no, now that we are in control of the state, you guys are no longer going to really police our side. Between 1923 and 1933, for example, the SA had been repeatedly banned. Some of their members had been arrested for things like assault or murder. The party paper had been closed down at times. But with Goering's order, again, the police are not supposed to be neutral anymore. They are supposed to shift the weight behind the Nazis in their kind of fight on the streets with the communists. They also, by the way, begin to go after the Social Democratic Party. Now, the SPD leaders are not they don't understand the gravity of the situation. Again, they don't foresee the speed with which events are going to move. When Goering and Frick, for example, ban the publication of some of the SPD newspapers, what do? They go to court. Now, going to court is a great thing to do. We live in the United States. We're living through some transitions right now, some new interpretations of laws, right? When people object to the new laws, the first thing they do is they sue. And then it starts this court process, and it takes a while to go through. And eventually the Supreme Court will say, well, this is what the law is. This is the rules of the game that we're going to play. Here are some ways that we think that it's different than what it existed before. Here are some ways that we think that the way that it existed before needs to stay the same. The problem is, during this phase when the Nazis are assaulting democracy, they move so fast that there isn't time to go to court, to get a court order, to get the court order enforced. Because who's the people enforcing the court order? At the very top, it's the Nazis themselves, who've already decided the rules of the game don't matter. A judge telling someone to do something, well, okay, where's your army? Who's going to enforce it? These early orders towards the police are just basically the first of many, many steps that the Nazis begin to take. 5 days later, on February 22nd, Hermann Goering goes even further. He orders 50,000 SA men to be deputized by the Prussian police, effectively making them agents of the state. And so again, this goes back to that kind of contradiction that I mentioned, this kind of paradox in a sort of mental way or ideological way. When the SA man goes on the street, goes into a bar, pub, finds a communist, punches him, is the deputized SA man doing that as an SA man? Or is he doing it as the legitimate instrument of the state? If he is doing it as the legitimate instrument of the state, am I not breaking the law by trying to resist whatever violence he is effecting on me? There isn't a clear answer as to how the person is acting because the Nazis intentionally blur the lines. We'll talk about this more in later episodes. But when Joseph Goebbels basically gets to become the head of the newly formed propaganda ministry, he does not see a distinction between his role as an agitator for the Nazi Party and his role as the agitator or as the minister of enlightenment for the German people. The goals of the party and the state are the same. And so as they come to focus on me and I don't like them, how do I respond? Let's get back, however, to February 1933, because there are some really key developments that we need to discuss. Goering and other Nazi leaders, as I said, move to deputize these guys from the SA, but this becomes a small step compared to what happens immediately afterwards. On February 27th, 1933, a Dutch anarchist named Marinus van der Lubbe sets fire to the German parliament building, or the Reichstag, supposedly as a protest basically against unemployment. Right? This is in the middle of the Great Depression. Times are tough. How do you express your anger? How do you express your outrage? Van der Lubbe decides, I'm going to do this through a selective act of violence. I'm going to target something that's big enough that, gets people to look and see what I'm interested in, to focus on my situation. And so he sets this fire, and the fire is pretty significant. The fire makes the Reichstag building unusable basically until after World War II, and then it gets kind of caught up in the Cold War. And so actually the Reichstag, which is today called the Bundestag, will not reopen until 1999. So 66 years they didn't use it because of this fire. Now, whether the Nazis did this because they were angry and were reacting to the circumstances, or whether they were kind of cynical and opportunist, they basically used the Reichstag fire to destroy the rule of law. They use it as an excuse to create a legal basis for Hitler's dictatorship. The short story here is basically that they claim that this is an attack led by the communists, that the communists are trying to start a revolution, and so this was a big kind of symbolic, kind of bonfire, if you will, to kind of kick things off. And so the response is not just to go after van der Lubbe as an individual, but they say we got to go systematically against the communists. We have to remove them institutionally as a force in German politics. Towards this end, the next day Hitler, with the backing of his conservative nationalist allies in the cabinet, asks and receives from Hindenburg the temporary revocation of most German civil rights. Now, this was known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, and it enables the government to arrest and detain people without trial. It suspends the right to freedom of assembly. It suspends the right of freedom of the press. Very importantly, it says, this is such a national emergency, you, Hitler, acting through the cabinet, can also ignore local laws. You can ignore the laws of the individual German states because this is a national emergency. Following the issuing of the Reichstag Fire decree, German police will arrest over 4,000 communists in the first night. They raid Communist Party headquarters. They find membership rolls. They find who's the financiers, who's giving money to the Communist Party of Germany. They arrest those people. By the end of March, over 20,000 people had been arrested. By the time you get to the summer of 1933, over 200,000 Germans have been arrested. Not just communists, by the way, at this point. As long as we're kind of ignoring the rule of law, as long as we're kind of, just doing whatever we feel like, well, who's going to stop us if we arrest a couple of social democrats as well? Who's going to stop us if we grab a trade union leader off the street and throw him in a concentration camp? And so as we talked about in our Patreon-only episode on the history of the concentration camps, why are concentration camps first formed? What is their initial function? It is to deal with the massive numbers of prisoners that are generated by this wave of arrests that follows the Reichstag Fire decree. The Weimar penal system is not set up for the immediate arrest of 200,000 people. So where are you going to incarcerate said people? Well, we're going to build these things called concentration camps, and we're going to put people in it. And again, you can listen to the Patreon-only episode if you want the full story there. Despite this success in arresting people, Hitler is not content with just having the temporary suspension of civil rights. The Reichstag Fire decree is supposed to be about an emergency, and people in February and March of 1933 are willing to at least buy that. They're willing to at least, this is an emergency. We just had this happen. You want, again, a historical example. The United States, after 9/11, people said, okay, yeah, I'm okay with the government spying on me because we got to find the bad guys. I'm willing to give up some of my civil liberties and civil rights because we got to win the bigger war here. It's an emergency. What happens when the emergency ends? Hitler and the Nazis, again, the way they approach the question of governance is not about the moment. It's not about just, who's in power now? Did we win this fight? Did we defeat the communists? It is to think of things in terms of an ideological war. You fight the war until the enemy is destroyed. And so as long as the Weimar Constitution exists, as long as these civil rights can come back, the war isn't over. Now, one of the biggest obstacles to Nazi power is actually elections that were scheduled for March 5th, 1933. So like a week after this Reichstag fire, a week after they start arresting everybody, there's going to be an election to the Reichstag. Now, when those elections take place, the Nazis obviously don't look at it as, well, let's just see what the will of the people is. The Nazis are going to put pressure on individuals, on organizations, to try to get the outcome they desire, which is a massive number of seats in the Reichstag. They, as I mentioned, had already initiated this massive campaign of suppression against the Communist Party. They do everything except ban the party outright, because when people vote, they want them to go and vote for the communists if they're of a certain sort of political persuasion. What you don't want is that you ban the Communist Party, and so all the communist voters are mad, and they go to the polls and they vote for the Social Democrats. Now, all of a sudden, you've just inflated the power of the Social Democrats. You want to beat them back too. And so they leave the party on the ballot, but ban it from basically electioneering. You, of course, have all these SA guys who are now deputized. And the SA guys like to go around. They like to watch people voting. They like to look menacingly on you. The Nazis will use their new powers to suppress rival publications. But despite these massive advantages in terms of money and power, however, the Nazis only get 44% of the vote. Think about that for a moment. In the summer of 1932, they get 37% of the vote. With all of the repression, with all the levels of power, with the communists basically eliminated in everything but name, they only increase their vote share by 7%. The Nazis' main sort of multi-party ally in this story is the DNVP, the German National People's Party. The German National People's Party, they get a whopping 8%. So on the one hand, all of these kind of elections, all this political crisis in 1932, 33, it had started out because you couldn't get a working majority in the Reichstag. So now the Nazis have, with a coalition partner, they do finally have a majority. But again, the Nazis are not interested in the regular order of business. They want to change the Constitution. They want to make Hitler dictator. 52% is not going to be enough to get there. So again, how do the Nazis pull this off? They did not have on their own enough legal authority to drive through the changes that Hitler wanted. And so here we're going to see several of the things that I talked about in the introduction coming together. For the Nazis, the emergency powers granted by the Reichstag Fire decree, the arrest of thousands of communists, this isn't enough. They sought instead a new, aggressive way to expand their power, to achieve their revolution, and that was the passage of a law known as the Law to Remedy the Suffering of the People and the Reich, which is just an awful, it's a great marketing name, but it doesn't tell you anything about what the bill actually does. Historians today call it the Enabling Act. It was offered on March 23rd, 1933, so about 4 weeks after the Reichstag fire. The Enabling Act would give the Nazi-led government the right to issue legislation on its own for a period of 4 years, or until Hindenburg dismissed the Chancellor. Moreover, not only are we just eliminating now the Reichstag, eliminating the entire legislative branch of government, but the new laws, according to the Enabling Act, can deviate from the Constitution in any area that the Chancellor wants, unless they deal with the Reichstag, the Federal Council, or the President. So in other words, you can change any laws that you want. The only thing you can't do is mess with the provisions that talk about the structure of the government itself. Think about the gravity of this situation. Think about going into it understanding what voting on this bill meant. You are going to give 4 years of unlimited power to a man who had pledged to carry out a revolution. You are going to eliminate in reality, if not in name, the entire legislative branch of the government. You are going to make the only check on Hitler's power an 85-year-old former army general who doesn't really seem to care much about democracy, who's an arch-conservative, and who also, by the way, in 1932 tried to play around with his how do I become president for life and not have to run for elections anymore? Also, if we're thinking about what if a political leader, I always use the United States, what if a political leader in France tomorrow said, hey, I want to become a dictator? What if there was another Napoleon that ran, another Bonaparte, never put those guys in office because they don't really respect democracy? And that guy came out and he said, I'm going to just abolish all the laws and I'm just going to take complete power for myself. Don't you think there'd be kind of more of a hubbub about it? Wouldn't people understand exactly what they were voting for, what it meant? And yet, by basing these changes in law itself, the Nazis figure out how to get the power that they want without facing blowback from the general population. How do you get people to discard all these natural rights that German and European liberals have been going on about, have been fighting for, have been trying to defend and valorize for 2 centuries? You do it by using the same system of elected parliamentary representatives that those same liberals had said were the key towards establishing and defending those rights. You turn the classical liberal political system against itself, And then you put those who want to defend democracy and the rule of law and the idea of natural rights, you put them in a bind. If the will of the people is to get rid of these rights, then how can you say you believe in the will of the people? If the will of a democratic society is dictatorship, how do you say we can't have a dictatorship? There is, of course, a second, perhaps even more troubling thing that we need to recognize here. I mentioned just a moment ago that the Nazis have 52% of the parliament because they've got their allies in the DNVP. To change the Constitution, to carry off something as big a deal as the Enabling Act, you need a 2/3 majority. Where are they going to get the other 14% of the votes to pass this law destroying German democracy? The answer is they get people who should have known better to support the destruction of their own rights. Now, the Nazis also used some violence here. One of the things that you have to do, of course, before you have a legislative vote on anything is you have to establish quorum. And the Nazis have just arrested thousands and thousands of communists, and of course they also arrested the delegates to the Reichstag. So how are you going to get to quorum? Well, Goering basically pretends like the communists don't exist. When they come to the vote on the Enabling Act, the SPD, who at this point is the Nazis' main political opponents, the SPD votes unanimously against the bill, minus a couple deputies who were in hiding or who had themselves been arrested. The SPD delegate, Otto Wels, gives this impassionate speech on the floor of the Reichstag. Right? It's not yet a totalitarian state. You're still in parliament. You still have the right to parliamentary immunity, at least in terms of speaking. And he passionately opposes the legislation. He defiantly declares that, quote, "We stand by the principles of a state based on the rule of law, of equality, of equal rights, of social justice. In this historic hour, we German Social Democrats solemnly pledge ourselves to the principles of humanity and justice, of freedom and socialism. No enabling act gives you the power to destroy the ideas that are eternal and indestructible." Incredibly powerful words, incredibly courageous words. Wels knows as he's giving this speech that he is likely to be arrested. There are literally SA men in the chamber with them as they're holding this vote. And yet he realizes the power of the moment. He realizes the history, the symbolism. And the other SPD delegates do as well. Unfortunately, other members of the Reichstag prove more pliable. They don't want to anger Hitler. They are thinking about the idea of self-preservation. They tell themselves the lie that if I just go along with the storm, it won't sweep me away. If I just acquiesce to Hitler, if I kneel, if I show him that I'm obedient, that I'll do what I'm told, that I'm not going to challenge him, then I'll be left alone, and that is enough. All of the small parties in the Reichstag vote for the Enabling Act, including the descendants of the National Liberal Party. Now, I know this, we talked about this many, many episodes ago. The National Liberal Party had been the main party at the time of the founding of the German Empire. The National Liberals are the ones who make the creation of the German Empire possible, in that they take the kind of broader liberal consensus among other parts of Germany, and they say, we're going to weld this to Otto von Bismarck and the Prussian monarchy, and it's going to work out okay. So they are such a fundamental key part of the founding of the German state itself, and yet they go along with destroying it and destroying the rule of law, which was one of the whole reasons that the party itself was initially founded. This then essentially leaves the moderate Catholic Center Party as the decisive vote. And again, not to go too deep into the history here, but as the victims of repression during the first decade of the German Empire, this was the so-called Kulturkampf, when they were arresting Catholic bishops, when they were kind of repressing Catholics. You would think that the Center Party knew better than anyone else the importance of democratic government, the importance of things like individual rights, and the importance of the supremacy of law. And just to dispel any romantic notions that the Center Party might have thought, well, maybe there's a place for us in Hitler's government. Papen was a former member of the Center Party. Some Center Party delegates thought that they might get a seat in the Hitler's cabinet. But already by the time that the election is going on, the Nazis are allowing the SA to go after the Center Party. They're allowing stormtroopers to break up meetings, to assault candidates from the Center Party. And yet the party's leader, Ludwig Kaas, did the thing that we humans do all too often when confronted with evil. He rationalized his own capitulation. He told himself that if only I can get Hitler to make promises to protect me and my group from the storm, from the violence, if only he will agree to respect Catholic civil rights, to respect the independence of the church, if only Hitler will say, fine, I will take complete power, but don't worry, I'm not going to fire any Catholic civil servants. We're just going to go after Jews, and we'll just go after socialists, but not you. Well, then maybe it's okay. Maybe we can go along with this. And so to put this in the terms that Václav Havel would have understood, Kaas accepts his party's powerlessness and the powerlessness now of all Germans because he had made a deal. He promised to get this in writing from Hitler. Hitler never actually writes it because, as you can probably guess, the second that this thing gets passed, the Nazis don't care about the Center Party. They don't care about some unenforceable deal that you made. Hitler's not a man whose word of honor means anything. Soon after the passage of the Enabling Act, Kaas will go to Rome. He will try to start negotiating a deal between the Nazis and the Catholic Church, known as the Reichskonkordat. And this deal paves the way for millions of German Catholics to set aside their moral concerns about Nazism. And in particular, one of the things that Catholics were really, really bothered by about Nazism is what does the racial interpretation of Judaism mean for Catholics? In other words, if you were Jewish and you converted to Catholicism and you got baptized, aren't you now a Christian? But according to the Nazis, Judaism isn't a religion. Judaism isn't a set of beliefs. It is a racial identity that doesn't get changed through baptism. Kaas wasn't thinking about that when he made his deal. Didn't get that, not even in writing, didn't even get that part promised. For his pain, Kaas essentially becomes exiled to the Vatican. He would eventually serve as a canon of St. Peter's, and then he dies in 1952. But his role in German politics is essentially to be erased at this point. I've already sort of said that the Enabling Act passed. Just to give you the vote totals, it was 444 in favor, 94 against. The Reichstag essentially votes itself out of existence. Legally, it's still there. They will meet sometimes. But in terms of practicality, the Reichstag no longer exists. Again, this is a watershed moment in German history. The passage of the Enabling Act creates the legal framework for dictatorship. From now on, no civil rights effectively exist in Germany. There were no mechanisms to compel new elections at any time outside the office of the president. And as I mentioned, Hindenburg had been pretty obvious about the fact that he didn't care about democracy. Also, he's 85. What happens when he dies? To put it metaphorically, the fox was now officially in charge of the henhouse. And it would not take him long to take advantage of the situation. Now, as all these debates are going on about the question of the Enabling Act, the Nazis also move to destroy the sort of political landscape, if you will, of the Weimar Republic. They start going after individual political parties, seeking to destroy them, and eventually they will ban them once they have the full powers given to them by the Enabling Act. Already the day after the March 5th elections, the Nazis decide the communists have kind of fulfilled their purpose, the election is over, and so on March 6th, the KPD is officially banned. Having eliminated the communists, the Nazis then move to the next sort of party, ideologically speaking, which is the Social Democratic Party. I already mentioned that they had attacked some Social Democrats, they had arrested some Social Democrats, but now they would begin a more concerted effort to eliminate their other kind of big rival out there. In Nazi-led state governments, they begin to ban or arrest the leading members of the party, and they also extend or enforce new bans on SPD-leaning newspapers. SPD Reichstag delegates face physical intimidation. Many of them will be beaten. Some of them are tortured by SA men. Some of them are even murdered. Now, as the axe began to fall on the SPD, and again, some of this even kind of predates a little bit March 5th, those closest to them in political and social terms reacted in the absolute worst and most cowardly way possible. They again made this kind of deal with themselves, or they told themselves this kind of lie: the path to self-preservation is obedience. If I accept what Hitler is doing as legitimate, then Hitler will leave me alone. Many of you have probably heard of the pastor Martin Niemöller's famous 1946 poem about how first they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. And then he goes through I was not a trade unionist, I was not a social democrat, and then they came for me, and no one was left to speak for me. Although this poem was actually written in 1946 after it was over, after Niemöller had spent time in a concentration camp, it is spot on. As the Nazis begin to move against their political opponents, instead of rallying together to defend the principles of democracy, natural rights, civic rights, those sorts of things, the Nazis' opponents hide behind the idea of self-preservation, and in the end, not only are there other, kind of neighborly parties destroyed, but they themselves will also quickly be swept up and destroyed. As the screws tightened on the SPD, for example, the trade unions respond by distancing themselves from the socialists. On March 21st, 2 days before even the passage of the Enabling Act, the socialist-leaning trade unions declare that they have no intention in getting involved in politics. We are just an economic organization. We're going to withdraw our voices from the political sphere. And by withdrawing, we're signaling obedience. We're signaling subservience. Just leave us alone. Just as the Catholics would soon find out, Hitler's empty promises held little value after he got the thing that he wanted. In exchange for renouncing their SPD allies, for example, the trade unionists get the promotion of May 1st to a national holiday. Now, working class people had long used May 1st as a way to celebrate working class identity, celebrate the value of working class people in society, right? The people that make society work. It's not just those aristocrats. It's not just those nobles. It's not just the wealthy merchants. Today we would say it's not just the tech bros, but it's the ordinary folks. It's the working class people, the blue collar people that really have value in society. So when the Nazis say, hey, we'll make this into a national holiday, it can then become a sort of excuse for the trade unions to say, look, we're getting something for this. We're getting the recognition that we want. Yeah, fine. The Nazis are going to go after, the Social Democrats. They're going to violate democratic norms. But who really cares? We're getting something out of this deal. To signal their new idea of obedience, some members of the trade unions, when they march in those May 1st holidays, they will wear the red, black, and white colors that are used by the Nazis, but more importantly, were sort of traditional German imperial colors, were the colors that Bismarck really liked. They abandoned the traditional socialist red color. Again, don't worry, Hitler. We're not going to oppose you. You want to take over? You want to abolish the rule of law? Fine. We'll go along with it. We got our holiday. We're happy. Leave us alone. The president of the Textile Workers Union even marches under a swastika flag. So what did they get for all this accommodation? For all this, to use another kind of loaded word, appeasement? What did they get for their appeasement? Well, the trade unions actually are officially banned the day after May 1st and the May Day parades. They don't just get banned or dissolved. SA and SS men come into their offices. They tear them apart. They arrest many of the movement's national leaders. They throw them in concentration camps. They kind of send a message to other unions. So on May 4th, just a couple days after the sort of socialist trade unions have been taken apart, the smaller Christian trade unions start saying, just totally randomly, by the way, we decided to change our leadership. We had a new election. And Hitler's now officially in charge of our trade union. They essentially decide that the path of least resistance is to dissolve yourself or to Nazify yourself, and that's the way that you survive the storm. Resistance, other than the SPD and to some extent the communists, this doesn't occur to people. There is no serious challenge mounted to the Nazis seizing power. Now, having broken the trade unions, the Nazis go, okay, well, now we can get rid of that annoying SPD. There's no chance that there's going to be a general strike because the organizations that would have been used to coordinate a general strike, we just destroyed them all. They don't exist anymore. On May 10th, about a week later, the Nazis seize all of the SPD's assets, effectively destroying its ability to function. 5 weeks later, on June 21st, 1933, so again, this is still in the first couple months of Hitler coming to power, the various state governments acting on behalf of Wilhelm Frick, the interior minister, they will now ban all SPD meetings, publications, politicking. 3,000 SPD members are immediately arrested and sent to concentration camps like Dachau, where many are tortured, again, many are beaten, and some are killed. On July 14th, the party is officially outlawed nationwide. Now, again, as this assault on democracy is taking place, you would think that people in civil society would see it and go, oh, this isn't good. We need to stop this. We need to protest against it. I want to make my voice heard. Instead, they either cheer the downfall of hated rivals, or again, we've seen this time and time again. How do I avoid the storm? I accommodate it. I make this deal. I accept my own powerlessness. I kneel in the kind of Avengers metaphor here. And hopefully that will protect me from the violence that is coming. We saw this already from the leaders of the Catholic Center Party in the run-up to the Enabling Act vote. It continues into May of 1933. At this point, Catholic bishops who had said, well, you can't be a good Catholic and a member of the Nazi Party. You can't come in and get, your sacraments. You can't get confession if you're a member of the Nazi Party from the Catholic Church. They start to say, oh, well, you know what? These Nazis aren't so bad. These Nazis are destroying the communists who are our enemies. And so, we'll make an accommodation with them. We'll start working on a bigger deal between the Catholic Church as an international institution and the Nazi Party. On June 1st, members of the Fulda Bishops' Conference even issue a public statement. They welcome the quote-unquote national awakening led by Hitler. And so what do they win for this? Are they protected from the storm? Are they celebrated? Are they honored? Do they get some kind of kickback? Well, for the Catholics who had been critical of the Nazis before 1933, that does not work out well at all. Many of them are arrested, their papers are confiscated or banished. Politically speaking, it also leads to the destruction of the Center Party. On July 1st, the Vatican signs a concordat with Nazi Germany, and as part of this deal, the Catholic Center Party says, look, okay, we'll get the right of the church to continue to function. We'll get the right of Catholics to continue to believe in Catholicism and have services and stuff like that. Yay, I guess we already had that before, but as long as we can keep that, then we will delete or dissolve our political body, our political voice, which is the Center Party. Which again, just to put this in a little more historical context, the thing that had enabled the Catholics to survive and to win in some cases the Kulturkampf in the 1870s was the formation of a political party that then expressed their views and then participated in governance. Instead of saying, hey, maybe we should follow the historical blueprint that proved effective in the 1870s, they try to hide from the storm. They try to say, just let me live, let us live as a kind of as an institution, as a religion, and in exchange for that, you can do whatever the hell you want with everyone else. On July 5th, 1933, the Catholic Center Party officially dissolved itself, recommending that its former members should now support National Socialism. Mopping up the other political parties at this point is kind of a fairly easy task, as you might imagine. The Liberal Democratic Party, the DDP, had renamed themselves the Staatspartei, the state party, right? It's kind of moving away from ideas of democracy anyways. They had voted for the Enabling Act, but they are accused of collaboration with the SPD, and they are stripped of their delegates. In June 1933, they are also prohibited from electioneering, and the party is officially dissolved on June 28, 1933. The DVP, the German People's Party, has a whopping 2 seats in the Reichstag at this point, so they're kind of already irrelevant. Nevertheless, they get into a big debate. Should we just dissolve ourselves, or should we just go over to the Nazi Party entirely and just join them? And so actually about half of their membership leaves and just joins the Nazi Party anyways, at which point it doesn't really matter. Finally, there's one last party that we just want to mention here, which is the German National People's Party, or the DNVP. These were, of course, the Nazis' junior partners in the Nationalist Coalition formed on January 30th, 1933. You would think that as the storm breaks upon the communists, as it breaks upon the Social Democrats, the DNVP is very happy. In fact, they played a key role in authoring parts of the Enabling Act. But you would think, having proved their utility, having proved their loyalty to the Nazis, the sort of Faustian bargain that they get out of this is preservation, or they get some kind of benefits. They get to keep running ministries, or they get to keep having a prominent role. Despite the fact that the DNVP had a strong degree of ideological similarity with the Nazis, at least in certain areas, despite the fact that they had been working together, that they had vocally supported the Enabling Act and Hitler, what do they win for their troubles? Monty showed them what is behind door number 1. It is, of course, being the targets of SA violence. Already, by May, you have the DNVP's Reichstag leader, Ernst Oberfohren, having his house searched. On May the 7th, he turns up mysteriously dead. At this point, other DNVP leaders begin to also become arrested or attacked, including Alfred Hugenberg, who is literally the leader of the party, who is in the cabinet, who is close with Paul von Hindenburg, who, if anyone out of all the non-Nazis, should have been in a pretty good place to resist Hitler. Certainly, many conservatives support the initial Hitler dictatorship because Hugenberg is there. Now Hugenberg will be pressured to resign. At the end of May, Hitler privately demands that the DNVP dissolve itself. What's the point, guys? We're living in a National Socialist world at this point. Hugenberg, at this point, he makes a kind of desperate attempt for relevance. He goes to, I believe it's London, and he's participating in a kind of international conference. And he says, hey, you guys should give Germany its colonies back or else. And this really pisses off Hitler because he didn't talk to Hitler about it. Hitler is not yet ready for a war. He hasn't yet started the rearmament program. And so when he gets home, Hitler says, you have to resign from the cabinet. And then party members begin defecting en masse to the Nazis. At this point, hand in hat, Hugenberg says, look, I will dissolve the party. We will all go away and accept our subservience if, and stop me if you've heard this before, if you promise not to fire our civil servants, if you promise not to arrest our former members. So by July 4th, 1933, just 5 months after taking power, all of Weimar's major political parties were gone. To drive the point home, on July 14th, the Nazis made their legal dominance permanent by passing through the cabinet, or what's left of the cabinet, the law against the formation of parties. It officially outlawed any attempt to found or to maintain a political party, officially making Germany a one-party state. It's easy in retrospect to look back and pass judgment on those who should have known better. How could the trade unionists and the Catholics not understand that as the Nazis destroyed the communists, and to some extent the Social Democrats, that they would be next? How stupid could men like von Papen or DNVP leader Alfred Hugenberg be to think that they could control a man like Hitler? Was it not obvious to the men charged with defending and enforcing the law, the police, the judges, the trial lawyers? Was it not obvious to them that the abandonment of those classical liberal principles of belief in the existence of natural rights, was it not obvious to them that this abandonment would come at a steep price? In some ways, it's complicated to answer that question. On the one hand, we do have to remember the context in which the Nazi seizure of power occurred. For 3 years, Germans had suffered under the crippling circumstances of the Depression. Their elected political representatives had failed to find solutions to these very pressing and very practical problems. And the more time passed, the more absurd and impossible democratic governments seemed. Governments came and went. The elections continued to not produce a decisive majority. And the political and economic crises that were fueling all of this continued to get worse and worse. By the start of 1933, many nationalists, some of whom had never really believed in the Republic in the first place, they had become convinced that some sort of dictatorship was the only path forward. Millions of ordinary Germans had also come to believe this. The army and most of its officers had already come to accept this. They were actively hoping for a dictatorship. Nor, by the way, was this an exclusively German phenomenon. In country after country in Europe, democracies either fell outright to dictatorships or they became increasingly dictatorial. For many Germans, then, the Nazi Revolution was not about violence and loss, but promised order and a return to normality. And in a way, that Faustian bargain, abandoning a variety of political and legal traditions in exchange for a return to normalcy, this was how millions of Germans rationalized the destruction of their republic. Abstract rights, the specter of violence, these all seemed secondary to the more pressing questions about solving the Depression, and, I should add, because this sometimes gets left out, also returning Germany to a state of national glory or prominence. The psychological burden of feeling like you were in a powerful, worldly dominant, worldly important state, going to one that felt like it was absolutely weak and powerless. This was a huge source of embarrassment for Germans, and the inability of Weimar to be strong is something that attracted them to Hitler. Of course, the price to be paid for this contortion was enormous. For the Nazis not only created a dictatorship, they went beyond the mere idea of consolidating power. They would create new institutions and new mechanisms that would normalize the use of violence as a tool for governing. We are talking here not only about things like concentration camps, but about various new courts and prisons that operate outside the rule of law. We are talking about the evolution or adaptation of judicial tools like the idea of protective custody, so that we no longer have to deal with the idea of due process. Most horrifically, we are talking before 1939, before the outbreak of war, about what would become the implementation of horrific programs to sterilize and murder members of their own nation. And by the way, I am not talking here about the Holocaust, which doesn't really start until 1941, you could argue. We are talking here about programs that are set up to repress so-called Aryan Germans. What started as a means to an end in terms of creating a dictatorship quickly evolved for some Germans into a living nightmare. And this isn't just, again, the kind of people that were already disliked, already marginalized. We're not just talking here about communists and socialists, Jews and homosexuals. We are talking here about conservatives. We haven't gotten there yet, but we'll get to the purge of the Night of the Long Knives, the Room Purge in 1934. Franz von Pappen's day is coming. Some of his conservative allies' day is coming, not just to be removed from office, but to find themselves in concentration camps and in some cases even murdered. It is also coming, this living hell, for members of the NSDAP, some of whom wanted to further the revolution, and they also got theirs in the summer of 1934, as again, we'll talk about in a different episode. In the best case scenario, those who gave away their rights in exchange for security and prosperity, they would enjoy some of that in the 1930s, but they would still pay the piper during World War II. If not during its early years, then certainly by 44 and 45, when Germany faces an Armageddon. Now, we have an awful long way to go, obviously, before we get to that point in the story. We need to flush out, again, some of these details on these extra-legal programs and powers that the Nazis develop. And we also want to talk about the psychological implementation of dictatorship. I've talked a lot about today this kind of Faustian bargain, this kind of sense of, if I give up my liberty for security, to use the famous American revolutionary phrasing, then won't I at least have security? But there are other ways that people internalize their own subservience, their own dictatorship, this way again of kneeling before Loki, of giving up before the fight. And we're going to get into that at another point. But anyways, our next two episodes are going to start to focus on these things. And we're going to start out first and foremost by talking again about some of those structures set up in 1933, 1934 to complement or to enhance the Nazi dictatorship. But this is going to be it for now. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, please like, share, or subscribe. We greatly appreciate your support. Again, you can also check out some of our more specific episodes on Nazi German history on Patreon. That's just $2 a month, so check it out. At any rate, thanks for listening. We hope you join us next time as we take history off the page.